what he says should be done. Then, what's the problem? Yes, I invite Professor Ira Bedzow from New York Medical College to come and speak us about the difference between history, tradition, and the narrative, and what that has to do with Holocaust bioethics. Very excellent.
All right, can you hear me if I don't use a microphone? I'm not going to use a microphone. All right. First off, I want to say that I am both grateful and humbled to be here. First off, in terms of the fact that we're commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and to recognize not only the gravity of the event, but what the event, both in terms of the day itself and what the day is commemorating, how it speaks to our past, our present, and our future. I also want to say thank you and recognize the incredible scholarship that went into both the journal and today's event. As one of the guest editors with Dr. Stacey Gallen, I learned so much from all of the different speakers and from all of the different articles that were in the journal that I believe that I became a better scholar because of it, and for that I want to thank you. I'm going to go through my talk gingerly or slowly because it's something that, while I think about, it's also something that we take for granted. So I want to make sure that we look at the difference between history, tradition, and narrative in a way not in terms simply of what are the definitions of these terms, but how we approach history, how we approach the past, how we use the past not only to create or shape our contemporary identity, but how it shapes the way we look at what our goals should be for the future.
Sorry.
Slowly?
Do it the way you want, but I'm not sure if the camera captures the sound, if not in the microphone. But
Do you capture me?
Yes.
but
I don't care about the sound.
But you won't have the video.
I don't care. Do you care? I don't care. Do you guys care? Okay, perfect. One of the difficulties when you look at these intentional approaches to the past is the concept of memory itself. Now, we used to think, we traditionally think, it's common conception to think that memory is simply a recall of events. We think that when we remember something, we go back into our brains, we pick out the concept or we pick out the experience, and we communicate it, and then we bring it back and put it back on the shelf. That's not the way the research in cognitive psychology is shown. The research in cognitive psychology has shown that a memory or a evoking of a memory, whether it's a concept or it's an experience or it's anything that we wish to convey, is not a recall, but it's either a reinforcement or a recreation. So once you realize that memory is not static, it's not concrete, but it changes the more you actively bring it to the surface, then you must recognize that history, tradition, and narrative is not simply an approach to a concrete past that has existed and is no longer, but it's a bringing back the past to a present and to a future. So now, how does history, tradition, and narrative approach the past? History is the most scientific and the most quote-unquote objective approach to the past. And what do I mean by that? The historian, regardless of which historiography or which methodology of study of history the historian uses, tries to take himself or herself outside of the lived experience and look at it as an outside observer, as a quote-unquote objective observer. in studying the facts and studying the story, the historian tries to find a causative effect. It looks backwards and says, this occurred because of these precursors. In that respect, history is the most deterministic of study of the past. It looks at the way the past has occurred and says it could have occurred in no other way but to create the present in which we have it. However, history is also the freest of studies of the past. Because when you look at the historian is looking at it from an outside observer and said, this is what people have done. But through scientific study, through the achievement of rationality, we are not bound by previous events. We can immediately change and apply a new conception for the present and the future. So history has a conception of time that is the most modern of conceptions. It looks at time in a Humean respect or a Lockean respect of a summation of points or a summation of instances. It also looks at history, I would dare to say, even in an Einsteinian way, in terms of the historiography in which a person uses will look at time in a relative sense. How you look at important dates in history and the causative effect of those dates, if you look at it through great periods of time versus the everyday actions of a population, will extend your story of history to either be long or to be short. So the historian looks at time in a way that, or looks at history in a way that is both part of us, but also very separate. From an ethical perspective, the ethicist would say that looking at the past, we should not be a slave to our passions or experiences, but we should rise above and be free and autonomous to enliven or to create a new future based on rational principles. So the historian has the quote-unquote objective view of the past. Now let's go to tradition. Tradition is, in one respect, the pre-modern conception of history, while on the other respect, it is now enjoying a resurgence in terms of the views of the ways we should approach our past. The idea of tradition looks at the past as if the contemporary member of that tradition carries the past along with him or her and uses the past as a way to understand one's contemporary identity, to understand one's contemporary place in the world, while at the same time sees that person as the one who will continue that tradition into the future. One is both bound by tradition, while at the same time one is responsible for the growth or for the the growth of the tradition, as well as in many respects the suppression of that tradition at the same time. You can see this both in terms of personal views as well as social or societal views. For example, in a personal view, when you look at a person's life trajectory, you can take the traditional view and say, the way that I've carried myself, the way that I've acted as a child into my teenage years, into my adulthood, will shape the person who I am and who I will be. Change is much more difficult because I am carrying that with me. While at the same time, change could be richer and deeper because I'm carrying that with me. Now, I'll give you an example from the Jewish tradition, but I'm sure that the same idea comes out throughout many, many different traditions. So there's this view in the Jewish tradition where there's a disagreement between these two rabbis that says if a person has sinned, there's the potential for those sins to become considered not as willful transgressions, but as accidents or as mistakes made in one's life. Another rabbi says, I'm sorry, it's not that they'll turn into accidents or mistakes, but they'll actually become a merit for you. So the scholars of the tradition are trying to figure out, what does it mean that the sins of a person's past becomes as if they're either mistakes or they're merits? And the way they reconcile this is, if a person looks at their past and the errors of their youth in such a way that they have regret for it, and they are ashamed at the way they've acted, then it's seen as if it's a mistake because they will not carry those sins into the future. However, the other rabbi says, no, if someone looks at their past and holds those mistakes and holds those transgressions with them in order to inform the way that they make their future decisions will be so much greater because of the fear of committing the same mistakes that they made in their youth. So they become like merits, not because those past transgressions are okay. They become like merits because they serve as tools for better decisions to be made in the future. Societally, it's the same thing. A tradition can look at its past and be ashamed of it, and they can seek to suppress it or forget it. A society can also look at its past transgressions, and they can keep it ever present in order to ensure that their goals for the future will not repeat their mistakes of their youth. This view of time is not modern, although there's modern philosophers who talk about it. This view of time is reminiscent of Henri Bergson's conception of durée, or duration. It's also has precursor, or also has a view in William James's view in terms of the idea of time and memory. The way they look at time and memory, or duration, is that time is not discrete points, or memories are not just a collection in a photo album. But time and memories are, they seep into each other, and you cannot have a present, and you cannot have a future without understanding the influence of the past. It doesn't mean that the past is causative. It doesn't mean that the past is determinative. But what it does mean is that the past will inform the decisions that you make, either for good or for bad. Narrative is the trickiest of all approaches to the past. It has also become the most popular way of looking or engaging in previous events. So narrative is the postmodern view. It turns history into genealogy. It looks at the objective nature and says there is no such thing as objectivity. Everything is subjective. And everything comes from the place or the context that we observe. So what does that mean in terms of engaging the past? The past is no longer, like the historian, seen as something to study. There are no facts to reveal. It's no longer a tradition where people bear the burden of carrying an ethos through to the future. The past now becomes a tool or a canvas with which to paint one's own identity. The past is now something that is a storyline of my own creation. And that is both individual and societal. As an individual, I can highlight those things which I think are important today. I can suppress those things that I'm embarrassed as if they've never happened. And I can create a narrative, a storyline, a understanding of myself that's based on what I want to project into the world. You can see societally, politically, internationally today, that narrative has a very strong voice. The way that people are looking at approaching history are from a context in the goals that they want to create. The goals shape the view of the past, as opposed to the view of the past serving as a critique, a check, a balance towards to see if our goals are correct. What does this have to do with the Holocaust and bioethics? Well, I can imagine you think it's quite clear, but I'm going to play it out anyway. The Holocaust is a term that people use either to stop a conversation or to lighten a conversation. Now, what do I mean by lighten a conversation? That's a more difficult one first. So I don't know if you have this in Europe. In America, we have many different types of Nazis. We have soup Nazis. We have, and basically anyone we disagree with, we can call them Nazis. The reason why we call them Nazis is because the term is so absurd today that we think that Nazi is literally just someone who creates a scenario where they must be dogmatically correct, everyone else must be inferior based on their ideas or their perceptions, and therefore, in the war of ideas and in the war of identity, the Nazi has to run supreme. Silly. That's not the way we talk. It's the way, I should say, that's the way many people talk. That's not the way we should talk. The way the Holocaust stops a conversation is because the Holocaust was such an enormous event in history. Not to say that there weren't other genocides. Not to say that there weren't other forms of ethnic or racial cleansing. But the Holocaust was such an important event in history, given the fact that it was tied to a political ideology, a scientific ideology, a medical profession who was very efficient in carrying out a state-sponsored plan, that we don't know where to go from there. The view of learning is, who said this? I forget who said this, but there's a great idea that you can never learn from moral saints and you can never learn from the devil. They're too different from us for us to even see the comparison from who we live. Who can learn from a saint? They're perfect, we're not. Who can learn from the devil? They're evil, we're not. So when we use the term Holocaust, it becomes irrelevant because who could imagine it occurring again in history? To be very careful when we look at the Holocaust and bioethics today, we should make sure that we don't rely on subjective narrative. And we should not simply, although it is important to make sure that we have this approach, we should not simply be historians. We should look at our social lives, our personal lives, and our professional lives as part of a greater tradition. We need to understand the facts of what occurred, but we also need to understand how what occurred affects who we are today. We need to understand how what occurred is not someone else's story, but it is our story, and we bear the burden of making sure that our goals are not comparable to the goals of that which we were shaping. So when we talk about bioethics issues in terms of end-of-life care, or when we talk about issues in terms of public health, population health, when we talk about issues in terms of genetic engineering and the ideal conception of a human, we should look at the conversations of the past so as not only to not repeat them, but to learn from them. So that when we push ideas of public health, which public health is important, when we look at ideas of reproductive technology is an important tool. When we look at the challenges of end-of-life care and the suffering that people go through, we should make sure that we're taking the right view, not a subjective view, not simply a dispassionate objective view, but an empathetic view, a compassionate view, so that we make decisions that are both philosophically grounded